You are the new emperor, who has come to power after long upheavals and must urgently prove the antiquity and legitimacy of your rule. In your hands are the state treasury, obedient ministries, and the best architects in the country. Newspapers only report what benefits you, and the parliament obediently rubber stamps the necessary budgets. But outside, the ancient castles of your realm stand as warehouses, overgrown with shanties of the poor, looking like pathetic ruins. This messy, multi-layered reality laughs at your greatness and shows that the true history is too unseemly to inspire awe among the people. One decree from you, and entire historical districts are slated for demolition. Genuine layers of the past are destroyed, and in their place, perfect monumental facades of fresh stone are erected. What will you choose? To leave history as it is, with all its dirt and contradictions, or to order the invention of a magnificent Middle Ages, erasing all that is genuine but inconvenient from the face of the earth? You stand before a famous European castle. Tourists are taking photos, the guide is sharing stories about the Middle Ages, and the audio guide whispers about knights and sieges. Everything looks exactly how true medieval times should look. Sharp towers, crenellated walls, a cobblestone courtyard, a scene straight out of a history textbook. 5 minutes ago, you arrived by car. You bought a ticket at the box office with a modern terminal. You went through a metal detector. You took a brochure with a QR code. And now you are standing in front of the untouched Middle Ages. Now one question, just one. If these people preserved the past, why did they have to demolish so much? Because not a single one of the great European medieval monuments has reached us in the form in which it existed during the Middle Ages. Each of them has passed through the hands of architects from the 19th or 20th century, who made decisions about what to keep, what to remove, and what to add from their own perspective. And each time, these decisions were driven not by historical data, but by political needs, national myths, or the personal theories of a specific individual armed with a tape measure and a drafting pencil. This is not an accusation. It is a fact. Recorded in archives, in professional journals, in critical articles by contemporaries. It's just that guidebooks don't mention it, because behind every restored castle in Europe lies not only construction, there is destruction as well, of living neighborhoods, of foreign cultures, of entire centuries that did not fit the desired image. And the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes one thing. What you are shown as true medieval heritage has, to a significant extent, been created in the 19th and 20th centuries, purposefully, by political commission, with full awareness of what is being destroyed in the process. To understand how it worked, one must start with the man who created the system itself. His name was Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, and he articulated a principle that became the motto of an entire era. In his writings, there is a phrase he uttered without a shadow of doubt. To restore a building is not to maintain it, repair it, or rebuild it. It is to restore it to a state of completeness that may never have actually existed. Read this again. The state of completion that may have never truly existed. The architect openly states, "I am building what never was. I am constructing a past that seems right to me." This could be seen as a marginal view of a loner, if it weren't for the fact that this individual had received government contracts for the restoration of everything possible in France. If his students hadn't been sent all over Europe to apply the same methods. If his approach hadn't become the model for restorers in Germany, Austria-Hungary, Spain, and Portugal for the next 100 years. Viollet-le-Duc wrote the Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture française, a multi-volume dictionary of French medieval architecture featuring detailed illustrations, which was published from 1854 to 1868. It was not merely a reference work. It served as a guide on how the Middle Ages should look. Restorers across Europe used his drawings as models, copying the forms of windows, tower completions, and arcades. His illustrations became more authoritative than the actual surviving monuments because they were systematic, clear, and accessible. And here lies the paradox. It's one thing to do what Viollet-le-Duc did personally. It's quite another when an architect in Prague or Gdansk opens his dictionary and looks at the drawing of a tower's apex, unaware that this drawing is a reconstruction based on theory rather than on surviving examples. And thus he builds a medieval tower, relying not on the Middle Ages, but on the 19th century, which depicts the Middle Ages. Two layers of imagination. Let's start with the most honest example, the only architect who openly admitted what he does. But first, one fact that will help understand the scale. Eugène Viollet-le-Duc did not work on just one project. He restored the Notre Dame Cathedral, worked in Amiens, Carcassonne, Pierrefonds, Vézelay, and dozens of other locations across France, simultaneously, in different styles, under various political commissions. It was precisely because he was a state architect, the chief inspector of historical monuments in France. His methodology was not a personal experiment. It was state policy. The Château de Pierrefonds in the French department of Oise, by the mid-19th century, was a picturesque ruin. Blown up on the orders of Louis XIII back in 1617, it stood as a mound of stones for 240 years, during which time it became a beloved subject for Romantic artists. This is how contemporaries remembered it: beautifully ruined, covered in moss, honest in its incompleteness. In 1857, everything changed. Napoleon III decided to restore the castle as his personal country residence. The task was given to Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, the leading architect of the era, a man whose name will appear in this story again and again. Here's what is important to understand about Viollet-le-Duc and Pierrefonds. He himself, in his own writings, openly acknowledged, here he is not restoring, he is creating. The Hall of the Beautiful Ladies, one of the main objects of admiration for today's tourists, is entirely his original work. He personally designed the furniture. He personally conceived the paintings. He personally decided how the doorknobs should look in a medieval castle. No archaeological foundations, no historical documents describing the interiors. Only his own vision of what the ideal Middle Ages should be. Let's look at a specific example, the fireplace in the main hall of the castle. Viollet-le-Duc designed it from scratch, a monumental structure with figures of knights, heraldic symbols, and carved consoles. Today, tourists photograph it as a medieval fireplace. The only medieval aspect of this fireplace is its style. The object itself was created in the 1860s by Parisian craftsmen based on the architect's sketches. It is not a relic. It is an original work. It simply looks like what a relic should look like. The castle also houses the personal residence of Napoleon III, a series of rooms with the full comfort of the 19th century, including a heating system that was modern for its time, which could not possibly exist in a medieval castle. Yet from the outside they appear medieval. The image is primary. Comfort is secondary. However, comfort has been taken into account as well. He painted the interiors in loud shades of red, gold, and blue. His contemporaries were shocked. Accustomed to perceiving the Middle Ages as gray and gloomy, they didn't know how to react to this celebration of color. Viollet-le-Duc's response was simple. That's exactly how it was. Medieval castles were just like that before the paint wore off. He had no evidence, but his confidence was enough for two. Why did Napoleon III need this spectacle? He was a new emperor who came to power through a coup with no roots in the old aristocracy. He required architectural legitimization. A castle in a chivalric style was to serve as material proof. Here he is, the successor of the great kings of France. Here is the connection to the knightly tradition. All authentic. Almost. On the outside, the castle looked like a fortress from the 15th century. Inside, it resembled a 19th century palace. It was the perfect symbol of the regime, an ancient facade with modern substance. Just like Napoleon III himself, Bonapartist in form, yet embodying a bourgeois monarchy in content. Pierrefonds is at least honest in its dishonesty. Viollet-le-Duc did not hide that he was creating rather than restoring. In London, it was done differently. There, in the name of creating a proper Middle Ages, they demolished genuine medieval architecture. By the middle of the 19th century, the Tower of London was a vibrant city within a city. The Mint had been striking coins since 1282, almost 600 years. The royal menagerie housed exotic animals that the sovereigns received as gifts from foreign rulers. Archives stored state documents dating back to the 13th century. Officers lived in brick houses integrated into the fortress walls. A priest officiated in the chapel. Armorers worked in the arsenal. The tower was overcrowded, messy, and diverse, just like any true living organism that had survived 7 centuries. Then the restorers came. Architects Anthony Salvin and John Taylor took on the task in the 1850s. The result of their work is what we see today, and take for the original medieval appearance of the fortress. Look at what they did. To open up the view of the White Tower, the main structure of the tower, built by William the Conqueror in 1078, restorers demolished the remnants of the royal palace from the era of Henry III. A real palace, an authentic medieval building from the 13th century. It did not look imposing enough. It obstructed the beautiful view of the Norman Tower behind it. They removed it. The Mint is gone. The royal menagerie is dismantled. The record office, with archives of state documents, has been evicted. The brick residential buildings from the 18th century around the towers have been demolished. Windows that were installed in the 18th and 19th centuries have been removed and replaced with neo-Gothic ones in an antique style. The towers have been reclad with limestone from Kent to conceal the marks of time and present a uniform appearance. Stop for a moment. What exactly is happening in this list? They demolished the authentic 13th century palace. They removed the 600-year-old Mint. They tore down 18th century houses. They installed neo-Gothic windows. They altered the stone. All of this is done in the name of restoration and historical authenticity. But historical authenticity of what exactly? Not of the real tower. It was multi-layered, alive, untidy. It is the historical authenticity of an image that existed in the imagination of Victorian ideologues. And now, one specific fact that shatters all the usual perception of this place. The famous walkway connecting Wakefield and St. Thomas Towers is officially called the Salvin Bridge. Tourists walk across it thinking, here it is, a genuine medieval structure. In reality, this bridge was built in the 1860s. There was no historical crossing at this site. It was invented. Today it is labeled as historic. The Merlin battlements that make the tower resemble a stern fortress, they were deliberately added because by the mid-19th century, many of the towers had significantly lost them. A simple question arises. If the towers lost their battlements, it means someone removed them earlier. Thus, the tower without battlements is also a historical fact. However, this fact did not satisfy the restorers. Why did Victorian Britain need exactly such a tower? The answer lies in the same logic as Pierrefonds. The British Empire, during the reign of Queen Victoria, required a visual symbol of its own harsh power. Not a cluttered courtyard with a menagerie and a mint, though that is what the tower had been for most of its history, but rather a formidable, monolithic fortress of Norman ancestors, an image of an unbroken imperial lineage from William the Conqueror to Victoria. Not living history, legend. The irony is that in the creation of this legend, real evidence of actual history was destroyed. The palace of Henry III, which could have told us about the lives of English kings in the 13th century, is gone. It no longer exists. Tourists walk across the historic Salvin Bridge, unaware that behind them stood a real medieval palace, demolished for their convenience. Pay attention to the mechanism. In Pierrefonds, they built something new under the guise of the old. At the tower, they demolished the old so that a more convincing old could take its place. This subtle distinction will disappear entirely when we move to Belgium. Gravenstein Castle in Ghent has stood in the city center for over 8 centuries. It was built in 1180 by Philip of Alsace as a military residence for the Counts of Flanders. Over the next 500 years, life around it grew, expanded, and densified, just like any living city. By the 18th century, the castle was no longer a separate entity. It had become part of the urban fabric. Houses, workshops, and passages adjoined its walls from both outside and inside. People literally lived within the fortress walls. The Industrial Revolution added the final touch. In the main hall of the castle, in that very dungeon which is 800 years old, a steam engine from a cotton factory was installed. The looms operated right under the medieval vaults. Workers lived in extensions against the walls. It was an uncomfortable, unattractive, utterly real story. The story of an industrial city that made use of what it had. In 1893, architect Joseph Duval took on the task. A student and fanatic of Viollet-le-Duc's ideas, his mission was to restore the castle to its ideal year of 1880. What does it mean to return to the ideal year? It means to destroy everything that came after. Hundreds of houses that had literally fused with the castle over 500 years were demolished, not around, but as part. Buildings from the Renaissance and Baroque periods inside the courtyard were taken down. Gothic windows were removed and replaced with smaller Romanesque ones, because that looked more correct and older. The steam engine was taken away. The workers were too. Official documents from 1893 describe this as the clearing of the territory from unauthorized constructions. The word unauthorized is key here. Homes that had been built over 500 years, some of which existed even before the state institutions capable of sanctioning anything came into being, were retroactively declared illegal constructions. This allowed them to be demolished without formally acknowledging that what was being destroyed was living urban history. The residents of the houses adjacent to the castle lost their shelter. The exact number of families is unknown. However, it is known that these were neighborhoods that had existed in this place longer than the living could remember. Official documents described their demolition as clearing the area. Not demolition, clearing. But here is a detail worth remembering. There is almost no information about what the castle looked like in the 12th century. The flat roofs of the towers, which are now considered authentic, are a fantasy of Devala, based not on documents, but on theoretical ideas about Romanesque architecture. The shape of the windows is also his decision. He destroyed the real and built the imagined. And it is this imagined structure that is now considered genuine. The most accurate thing that can be said about the restoration of Gravenstein is that we do not know what the castle looked like in the 12th century. However, we do know exactly how the restoration from 1893 looked, and it is this that we take as the authentic version. In Ghent, they demolished from the outside. In Barcelona, they went a step further. There, they began to move the buildings themselves. Until 1911, there was no Gothic quarter in Barcelona. This phrase was not in common use. There was no such concept. The area was referred to as the Cathedral Quarter and was generally considered a poor slum, dirty, overcrowded, and inconvenient. Wealthy citizens preferred the new Eixample with its wide boulevards and modern houses. Then someone coined the term Gothic Quarter, and the machine started working. This someone included the architect Josep Puig i Cadafalch, one of the main ideologues of the Catalan cultural revival. He clearly set himself the task of creating a district that would convince the whole world of the depth of Catalan historical roots. Not to restore what was, to create what should be. This was a political project, wrapped in architectural terminology. For the World Exhibition of 1929, the area was carefully transformed to reflect a medieval tourist aesthetic. Facades were stripped of plaster to reveal the stone, which in actual medieval times had been hidden beneath it. Buildings were given Gothic details that they had never had before, and some structures were simply relocated. The Pedelius House is now the City Museum of History of Barcelona, located in Plaça del Rei. Tourists visit it as a centerpiece of authentic Barcelona antiquity. In 1931, this building was located in a different place. It was dismantled, transported, and reconstructed here because the construction of the new street Via Laietana required clearing the area. The building was relocated. The historical quarter was assembled like theatrical scenery. The Bisbe Bridge is one of the most photographed landmarks of medieval Barcelona. An elegant neo-Gothic arch over a narrow street. It is captured by thousands of tourists every day. It was built in 1928. It has no medieval prototype and never has had one. This is a pure invention of the 20th century. The facade of the cathedral, which is the main dominant feature of the district and is perceived by all as a prime example of medieval Gothic, was completed in 1913 based on the design by architect Josep Oriol Mestres. Before this, there stood a simple facade from the 16th century. It did not satisfy anyone. Too modest, too late, not picturesque enough. The new facade was created in a style that organically continues the existing parts of the cathedral, making the seam between the real Gothic and the 20th century Gothic virtually indistinguishable to the naked eye today. This encapsulates the highest mastery of such work, when the imitation is so good that no one thinks to check. These are details that are easy to overlook. They are not scandalous or sensational. They simply don't make it into tourist brochures. The neighborhood works precisely because its image is convincing. The narrow streets create the right scale. The stone on the facades creates the right texture. The Bisbee Bridge creates the right silhouette. All of this together produces the very impression for which it was designed. And it is so strong that the question of construction dates doesn't even come to mind. Now, take a moment to pause. Everything we've seen so far, Pierrefonds, the Tower, Ghent, Barcelona, has been a romantic version of reconstructing the past. Architects could be mistaken, could err, could serve the political ambitions of their clients. But in their actions, one can still discern something like an aesthetic logic. In the Czech Republic, this logic took on a different form. There, the architect destroyed the past not for the sake of beauty, but for the sake of theory. Karlstein Castle was founded in 1348 by Emperor Charles IV. Initially, it served as a repository for imperial regalia and sacred relics. It was here that the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, a fragment of the life-giving cross, and other relics that ensured the legitimacy of the monarch's power were to be stored. In medieval perceptions, it was one of the most important buildings in the world. In the 16th century, it underwent significant renovations. Architect Ulrich Austalis transformed it into a Renaissance residential palace. Comfortable rooms were added, gentle roofs were constructed, and new extensions were made. The logic was simple. Times had changed, and the castle was meant to serve people, not relics. By the 19th century, Karlstein looked like a typical, vibrant castle with layers of 6 centuries of history. Somewhat Gothic, somewhat Renaissance, somewhat Baroque. Just as it had always been. In 1887, Josef Moker took it on. The most obvious explanation for what happened next is that Moker meant well. He diligently researched the sources and aimed for historical accuracy. But then we need to explain one fact. He completely destroyed all the Renaissance rooms of Karlstein. He did not preserve them. He did not document them before demolition. He destroyed them because they distorted the Gothic ideal. This is not restoration. It is editing history according to the author's theory. Note what has been demolished. The Renaissance chambers of the 16th century are not a minor addition. These are living spaces where people genuinely lived and worked for several centuries after the function of relic storage became secondary. This was the way the building adapted to changed realities. A living history of adaptation, survival, continuation. Moker decided that this whole living history was a mistake, that the castle should look as it did in its moment of grandeur, that all subsequent changes needed to be erased. Moker's contemporaries did not remain silent. His work was publicly dissected in the press of the time. The wording was harsh. He destroyed the castle more effectively than the Swedes in the 17th century. The Swedish army inflicted serious damage on Karlstein during the 30 Years' War. But at least they did not set themselves the goal of bringing it to a unified style. Moker ordered the plaster to be stripped from the walls to reveal the stone underneath, probably because the exposed stone looked harsher and more medieval. The problem is that in the actual Middle Ages, walls were likely plastered and painted. We know this from the numerous preserved examples. Exposed stone is a modern image of the Middle Ages, one that solidified in the 19th century when people first encountered ruined and peeling medieval buildings and mistook their appearance for the original. Moker built not what was, but what he thought was right. The recognizable stepped silhouette of Karlstein with its sharp tower roofs, which today has been replicated on millions of postcards and magnets, is entirely the invention of Moker. Before him, the castle looked fundamentally different. Moker destroyed for theoretical reasons. Konrad Steinbrecht in neighboring Poland destroyed for political ones. And it is precisely this that makes the history of Malbork particularly illustrative. Between Karlstein and Malbork, there is one important difference. Moker worked in Bohemia, a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His project was not directly linked to territorial claims. Karlstein was simply a Czech castle that he wanted to bring to the correct appearance. Politics were present there, but indirectly. In Malbork, politics was the main focus, not a secondary one, not incidental, the main one. Malbork Castle is the largest brick fortress in the world. Built by the Teutonic Order in the 13th to 15th centuries, it covers an area of over 20 hectares. Its scale is truly impressive. The main building alone, the High Castle, contains around 30 million bricks. After the defeat of the Order at Grunwald in 1410 and their subsequent retreat, the castle passed to the Polish kings in 1457 and served as their residence for almost 300 years. It was a Polish establishment. Polish kings received foreign envoys here, conducted state ceremonies, and stored the treasury. 300 years. Then the cockroaches came, and the decay began. The arches of the High Castle were torn down for storage. The windows were broken for utilitarian purposes. The rooms became barracks. The same process that we witnessed in the Tower of London and Lisbon. The living history of the castle's use destroyed its original appearance far more effectively than any enemies ever could. In 1882, Prussia began a scientific restoration under the guidance of Konrad Steinbrecht. He worked for 40 years. His guiding principle was called stylistic uniformity. Everything that did not conform to the image of a 15th century Teutonic fortress was subject to removal. First and foremost, Polish layers. The traces of 300 years of Polish presence in the castle were systematically erased as contamination of the German site. The coats of arms of Polish kings were removed. Polish inscriptions were destroyed. Interiors decorated during the Polish period were remodeled. Steinbrecht added his elements to this. He filled the halls with replicas of furniture, wall paintings featuring Teutonic symbolism, and mannequins of knights in armor. It was not merely a restoration. It was a theatrical performance, an immersive experience of the German spirit. Pay attention to what was referred to as scientific restoration. Removing 3 centuries of Polish history is scientific. Adding mannequins in armor is also scientific. Writing Teutonic mottos on the walls where they have never been is also scientific. Here, science did not mean historical accuracy. It meant the presence of academic terminology justifying a politically desirable outcome. To understand the political context, Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Malbork more than 30 times, in person. Several times he held ceremonial events there. The castle was officially referred to as the Prussian Westminster, in analogy with the British symbol of state continuity. It was meant to serve as visual evidence, German culture existed in these lands earlier and deeper than Polish culture. The restoration was a territorial argument expressed in brick. In the 1930s, members of state youth organizations took an oath here. The regime that came to power exploited the revived image created by Steinbrecht for the propaganda of Eastern expansion. The same walls, the same towers, the same Teutonic severity, only now under a different banner. The same historical image initially served the Kaiser's regime, and later the ideology of the new regime. The walls remained silent. It was living people who assigned meaning to them. And then something uniquely astonishing happened. After the castle was about half destroyed in 1945, Polish restorers began to restore it. They did so based on the blueprints by Steinbrecht, Prussian blueprints, while removing the Teutonic elements that Steinbrecht had deliberately added. The same castle, different restorers, different political objectives, the same physical walls. This is perhaps the best illustration of what we are talking about. The stones themselves are neutral. It is those who lay them, or those who explain what they mean, who ascribe significance to them. What was happening in Bucharest fits into the same logic. However, there, it was not just ideology at play. The architectural manipulation reached its logical limit. In 1972, the center of Bucharest was one of the most historically layered urban quarters of Eastern Europe. The Uranus neighborhood, one of the oldest in the city, was built up with mansions from the 18th and 19th centuries, Orthodox monasteries with Baroque bell towers, synagogues, Protestant churches, and cobblestone alleys. The Văcărești Monastery, a grand complex from the early 18th century with 15-meter-high fortress walls and fresco cycles modeled after the monasteries of Mount Athos, was considered one of the most significant monuments of Romanian Baroque. It stood for 250 years. In 1977, the country was shaken by a devastating earthquake. It claimed thousands of lives and damaged hundreds of buildings. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu used the disaster as a pretext for what he called systematization, a massive restructuring of the city. Officially, it was a plan to clear the emergency fund and to construct modern housing. In practice, systematization meant the following: to demolish everything that preceded the regime and to erect an architectural monument to itself in its place. Demolitions took place at night. Residents were evicted within a few days, sometimes just a few hours. Furniture was taken out to the streets. Houses were torn down immediately, before any resistance could be organized. Over 4 years, from 1984 to 1988, around 40,000 houses were demolished. 19 Orthodox churches, 6 synagogues. The Văcărești Monastery was completely destroyed in 1986. It was simply torn down by excavators. Frescoes, walls, crypts. But here is a detail that reveals the mechanics of this process more accurately than any analysis. The Mihai Voda Monastery, a 16th century Orthodox complex, one of the oldest in Bucharest, also found itself in the demolition zone. It was not demolished. It was relocated. In 1985, the building was placed on rails and literally shifted 289 meters deeper into the block, behind a new residential block, so it wouldn't be visible from the street. The monastery exists. It is simply hidden, like an inconvenient fact that was not destroyed, but removed from sight. Where the Uranus district once stood, the Palace of the Parliament now rises, the second largest administrative building in the world after the Pentagon. 1,100 rooms, 12 floors above ground, 4 underground levels. It was constructed from 1984 to 1991 by a workforce of 100,000 workers simultaneously. Ceausescu personally inspected the construction once a week. He was executed before he could enter the building through the main gates. The monastery was moved, not demolished, not preserved, just removed from sight. This is a precise metaphor for everything that happened in Bucharest. The inconvenient past wasn't completely eradicated if it could simply be made invisible. If that wasn't possible, it was demolished. The tools varied. The principle remained the same. The past must appear as the present requires. The regime in Bucharest falsified the city. Salazar in Lisbon falsified the walls. Castelo de São Jorge, a castle on the hill overlooking Lisbon, was effectively buried under layers of later construction by the 19th century. The area was occupied by military barracks, prison buildings, and warehouses. The walls were barely visible behind plaster and tiled roofs. It was not a monument. It was an active military infrastructure. In 1938, the DGEMN agency, under the orders of dictator Antonio de Salazar, began a project officially referred to as reconstruction. The results were showcased at the Exhibition of the Portuguese World in 1941, coinciding with the 800th anniversary of the founding of the Portuguese kingdom. Huge masses of buildings from the 17th and 19th centuries have been demolished, including functioning military installations. The walls you see today in many places are concrete masonry from the 40s, styled to resemble rough-hewn stone. The entrance gates with a drawbridge have been recreated based on 16th century drawings, not from archaeological evidence, but from illustrations whose authenticity has not been seriously verified by anyone. Look at this logic more closely. 16th century drawings showed how the gates might have looked at that time. Based on these drawings, the gates were built in 1939. Now these gates stand before you as medieval. But the chain looks like this. Interpretation of the drawing, to concrete construction, to tourist attraction. And one more detail that captures the overall spirit of this reconstruction. The romantic gardens with live peacocks that today roam the castle courtyard are a product of the imagination of a 20th century landscape architect. In a medieval fortress, of course, there were no decorative gardens with exotic birds. There was a garrison there, not peacocks. The worst part is something else. During the reconstruction of the 1930s, archaeological layers from the 17th and 18th centuries were simply discarded as construction debris, without documentation, without study. Invaluable historical information was destroyed to make room for the image that the regime required. This is a key point that connects Bucharest and Lisbon. Ceausescu removed entire neighborhoods, real historical sites, to create a different historical narrative. Salazar discarded real archaeological layers from the castle, genuine historical evidence, in order to fabricate another historical narrative. The method is the same. The aims are different. The result is identical. The authentic past is obliterated, replaced by a manufactured image. The difference between Bucharest and Lisbon lies only in the scale of the instrument. In Romania, an entire city was demolished to erect a monument to the regime in its place. In Portugal, a single castle was reconstructed to serve as a monument to state legitimacy.
Both regimes used architectural heritage as a medium for their political messages, and both did this in the same way, by removing inconvenient layers and constructing desired images. Salazar used the castle as a decoration for the national holiday. The regime's connection with King Afonso Henriques, who founded Portugal in the 12th century, was expressed through concrete and peacocks. All the objects we've examined share one common feature. They had a real historical foundation. The ruins of Pierrefonds existed. The tower was built over centuries. Karlstein has stood since the 14th century. Even if restorers did whatever they pleased with this foundation, it was there. And now, a special case. An object where every detail is authentic, but the building as a whole is a fabrication. The Kreuzenstein Castle in Lower Austria, 40 kilometers from Vienna, is one of the most convincingly medieval castles in Europe.
Towers, passageways, a keep, a chapel, a well, an armory. Everything looks just as it does in movies about the Middle Ages. It's no wonder that this location was used for filming The Three Musketeers, Quest, and several other historical films. It was built between 1874 and 1906 on the foundations of small ruins from the 12th century. The client, Count Johann Nepomuk Wilczek, aimed to create an ideal medieval castle. The method was unique. For decades, he traveled across Europe, acquiring authentic medieval elements at auctions. Portals from France, window frames from Germany, arcade colonnades from Italy, door hinges from Austria. Each purchased element was integrated into new walls. The catapult in the castle courtyard is authentic, bought at an auction in another city. The window in the dining hall is genuine, dating back to the 14th century. Only the wall into which it is set was built in 1903. Here is the Kreuzenstein paradox. Each fragment is a documented antique, but the building they collectively form is entirely fictional from start to finish. Nowhere in history has there ever been a castle with that specific layout, with those precise proportions, and with that particular set of details. Count Wilczek was more honest than most restorers. He never claimed to be restoring a historical object. Kreuzenstein is his private museum, his personal Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art that has been created over 30 years. This honesty paradoxically makes Kreuzenstein more truthful than most officially authentic castles in Europe. And that is precisely why it looks more medieval than most actual medieval castles. Because it is assembled from the finest visual formulas of the era, carefully selected and composed. Real medieval castles did not look like that. They were shaped by local building traditions, economic constraints, and random decisions made over decades. They were heterogeneous. Kreuzenstein is perfect, precisely because it is a creation. This paradox, where authentic details form a fictional whole, is significant because it questions the very concept of authenticity. If every stone in Kreuzenstein is genuine, yet the castle itself is not, then what is real? There is something that should be said outright, as a personal observation, not as a historical fact. Kreuzenstein evokes a stronger medieval experience than most castles that were actually built in the Middle Ages. The reason for this is instructive. Real medieval castles were functional structures, constructed without a singular aesthetic plan, by various craftsmen in different eras, taking into account budget constraints, available materials, and the local climate. They lacked a unified concept. Kreuzenstein is entirely the product of a singular vision. Count Wilczek spent 30 years selecting elements that would create the most striking visual impact. He didn't create the Middle Ages. He created a concentrated extract of our conception of the Middle Ages. That's exactly why it has such an impact. That's why historical films are shot here. Not because Kreuzenstein resembles a real castle, but because it looks like what a real castle should be in our imagination. The question of authenticity is not rhetorical. There is an answer to it. One single, honest answer in this story. And it was not France, nor Germany, nor Austria that gave it. It was a country that was destroyed to its foundations in the year 44. The old town of Warsaw was destroyed by German troops in 1944 by about 80 to 90%. Methodically, purposefully, building by building. By the end of the war, it was not a ruin. It was a graveyard of stones. The Polish authorities have decided to restore the old town. To restore, not to build a new quarter in its place. This decision was not obvious. In 45, when Soviet and Polish troops entered Warsaw, many architects suggested building a new, modern city, rather than dealing with the ruins. A pragmatic approach. Reconstructing the destroyed is long and expensive. It's cheaper to start anew. A different path was chosen. The sources for the reconstruction were measurement drawings, pre-war photographs, and, to a significant extent, the paintings of the Venetian artist Bernardo Bellotto, who worked in Warsaw in the 18th century. His detailed urban landscapes captured the city's appearance with documentary precision. Restorers literally stood before these paintings and recreated what was depicted. This was the work of an investigator, not a restorer, using clues, photographs, and paintings to restore what had been destroyed. The fundamental difference from what Viollet-le-Duc, Mocher, or Steinbreck did is as follows. The Poles did not hide what they were doing. No one claimed that the Old Town was an authentic medieval structure. Everyone knew. It was a reconstruction. The buildings were new. The history was old. The architects did not pretend to be restorers. They were builders, working from old blueprints. This is the only instance in our entire history where the reconstruction of the past was completely transparent. It was not modestly mentioned in specialized architectural publications. It was a well-known fact, part of national identity. We rebuilt our city from the ashes. This is not a shameful secret. It is a source of pride. And this is precisely why the result received recognition that neither Carcassonne, nor Malbork, nor Karlstein achieved. In 1980, UNESCO included Warsaw in the list of World Heritage Sites. Not for its age, the buildings were less than 40 years old at that time, but for the unprecedented dedication of the nation to the reconstruction of its past. The phrasing is accurate and honest. Now compare this to Carcassonne. Carcassonne in southern France is the most famous medieval fortress in Europe. 2 layers of defensive walls, 52 towers, flat merlons, sharp slate roofs. Its tourist rating is among the highest in the country, 3 million visitors a year. Postcards sell by the millions. This is the first thing that comes to mind when people say medieval castle. It has a real history. The settlement on this hill has existed since the Iron Age. The Romans built fortifications here. The Visigoths added walls. The Carolingians remodeled it. The Counts of Tonquével turned the fortress into one of the major strongholds of southern France. In 1209, the Crusaders, led by Simon de Montfort, arrived here. The fortress was captured and the inhabitants were expelled. This is a real history, rich, brutal, fascinating. Eugène Viollet-le-Duc worked here from 1844 to 1879, and here is what he made of this place. Carcassonne, since the year 1659, after the Treaty of the Pyrenees, lost its military significance. The border of France was pushed south. The fortress began to decay. Locals dismantled the walls for building material. Quality hewn stone was used for constructing houses in the lower town. The space between the inner and outer rings of walls, the so-called foxes, was densely filled with houses of the poor. People lived here for generations. They were born in these houses, raised children, and died, all within what is now referred to as the untouched medieval fortress. Viollet-le-Duc demolished 52 residential houses. According to some archival records, the number was even higher. The residents were forcibly evicted. It was officially explained that they did not fit the appearance of the monument. In reality, they hindered the creation of the desired image. Then he rebuilt the towers and walls, adding gargoyles to the Cathedral of Saint-Nazaire. Most of these gargoyles were the product of his imagination. There were no medieval prototypes to reproduce them from. He created medieval monsters as he deemed fit. And finally, he covered it all with pointed slate roofs. Here arises a question that is hard to ignore. Carcassonne is located in the south of France, in the Occitanie region. The climate is Mediterranean. In summer, temperatures reach 40 degrees Celsius. The architectural tradition of the region features flat roofs or gently sloping roofs made of terracotta tiles, which have been produced and laid here for centuries. This material is absolutely organic to this place, this climate, and this building culture. Look at any historical city in Languedoc, Montpellier, Narbonne, Nimes. Terracotta is everywhere. Soft lines are everywhere. Viollet-le-Duc placed pointed cones covered with gray slate on Carcassonne. Slate is a material from northern France. Such roofs are characteristic of Normandy, Brittany, and the Paris region. They are designed for rain and snow, for the humid northern climate. They have no climatic, constructional, or historical relation to Occitan Carcassonne. Where did these roofs come from? From the architect's mind. From his idea of what a proper medieval fortress should look like. Viollet-le-Duc was a Parisian. His proper Middle Ages appeared northern in style. He simply transferred this vision to a southern structure. Architecture historians pointed out this discrepancy even during Viollet-le-Duc's lifetime. The criticism was specific. Towers in a Mediterranean climate could not have such roofs, neither technically nor economically. Slate was not quarried, used, or properly worked in the south. It would have to be transported from afar at great expense. No southern lord would build in such a manner. Viollet-le-Duc simply replied that this was precisely how the castle was supposed to look originally. Of course, he had no evidence to support his claim. Today, the roofs of Carcassonne are an icon, a visual symbol that is endlessly reproduced. Tourists come specifically for them. They are the ones being photographed. They create that absolutely medieval image for which 3 million people visit here each year. But they are a choice made by a 19th century architect, not history. There is another aspect of Carcassonne that is rarely mentioned in tourist materials. Alongside his work in Carcassonne, Viollet-le-Duc was restoring the Saint-Sernin Cathedral in Toulouse. For this project, He used stone that had been transported from Carcassonne. The stone turned out to be less durable than expected. Just 100 years later, it began to deteriorate, leading to what was dubbed reverse restoration in 1979, removing what Viollet-le-Duc had put in place and replacing it again. Thus, the restoration itself required restoration. This creates a closed loop, a logical outcome of an approach where the main criterion is appearance rather than longevity. So, what distinguishes Carcassonne from Warsaw? Only by one. In Warsaw, everyone knew that it was a reconstruction, and no one hid it. In Carcassonne, no one publicly declared, "We came up with this." On the contrary, the fortress is presented as an authentic medieval monument. Guidebooks talk about the Middle Ages. Guides discuss knights and sieges. The sharp slate roofs are passed off as a historical detail. This is where the difference lies. It's not in the method. The method is the same. It's in the honesty regarding the falsification. If you look at this machine from the outside, it operated according to the clear logic of the industrial age. The 19th century loved systems, classifications, and standards. Railways were built according to a unified technical standard. Telegraph networks followed a single protocol. School education was based on a uniform curriculum. Why shouldn't architectural heritage have its own standard? Viollet-le-Duc essentially established the standard for the correct Middle Ages. His books and the projects he completed became a model for all of Europe. Restorers learned from his works. Government agencies based their methodologies on his. His students spread across the continent and applied the same principles. Choose the correct style, remove everything superfluous, and complete the work to a sense of wholeness. It was not anarchy of individual quirks. It was a system with shared principles, common terminology, and unified criteria for evaluating results. Here's what's intriguing. All this activity was made possible precisely because new technologies emerged. Railway transportation allowed building materials to be delivered to places they could not reach before. Industrial production of bricks, cement, and metal structures provided materials that did not exist in the Middle Ages. And it was with their help that the Middle Ages were recreated. Steel beams inside cathedrals, concrete walls behind stone facades. The industrial era constructed an image of a pre-industrial past, utilizing all the advantages of industrialization. There is irony in this. Carcassonne is a product of that very industrial France which despised its industrial present and longed for its chivalric past. The sharp slate roofs were erected by the same hands that built factories and railways. The steam engines that transported building materials to Malbork, while other steam engines were working in the dungeon of Gravenstein, do not represent a contrast. They are part of the same civilization, crafting an industrial image of a pre-industrial past. Another detail that helps to understand the scale. Viollet-le-Duc was a state architect. Steinbrecht in Malbork worked for the Prussian state treasury. DGEMN in Lisbon is a state agency. All these people were not lone fanatics arbitrarily modifying others' buildings. They carried out state assignments with state funding. Behind each restored castle lies a state budget, a state decision, and a state objective. This is not an architectural history. This is a history of state management of the past. Now consider everything we've discussed as a unified system. Pierrefonds, Tower, Ghent, Barcelona, Karlstein, Malbork, Bucharest, Lisbon, Kruisenstein, Carcassonne. Different countries, different eras, different patrons, but the mechanism is one. Look at the timeline. In 1844, Viollet-le-Duc begins in Carcassonne. In 1857, in Pierrefonds. In 1863, the first drawings for the restoration of the tower. In 1882, Malbork. In 1887, Karlstein. In 1893, Gravenstein. This is half a century of continuous activity across Europe. Not random coincidences, a wave. Where is it from? From a single source, the political instability of the 19th century. The revolutions of 1848 shook the entire continent. Old monarchies sought new legitimacy. New nation-states, Germany, Italy, Belgium, needed historical myths to justify their right to exist. Catalonia demanded autonomy and sought historical grounds for it. Prussia argued with Poland over who owned the eastern territories. In each of these disputes, architecture provided an argument that could not be directly contested. Documents can be forged, chronicles can be rewritten, but the walls stand. The towers are visible. If a German castle on disputed territory appears older and more significant, that feeling in itself becomes a political fact. Romantic monarchies of the 19th century sought an image of a heroic past, and achieved it through the demolition of living quarters and the invention of Gothic details. Nationalist movements desired material proof of historical claims to territory, and obtained it through the removal of undesirable cultural layers. The dictatorships of the 20th century wanted grand backdrops for state celebrations, and acquired them through concrete battlements and discarded archaeology. In each case, restoration was a tool, not for preservation, for construction. When Steinbrecht was removing Polish layers from Malbork, he wasn't cleansing history, he was editing it. When Moker was demolishing the Renaissance rooms of Karlstein, he wasn't returning the castle to its origins. He was destroying 6 centuries to implement a theory. When Salazar was pouring concrete on the walls of Saint-Georges, he wasn't restoring the fortress. He was building a backdrop for his regime. The most interesting aspect of this whole story is not even the fact that it was done. It was done openly, documented, and discussed in professional publications. Technical solutions were published. Estimates have been preserved in archives. The criticism of contemporaries has been recorded. In the case of Moker and Karlstein, contemporaries explicitly referred to it as destruction. In the case of Bucharest, the demolition orders are stored in the state archives of Romania. This is not a conspiracy. It is something else, and perhaps more troubling. It is a collective decision, again and again, in different countries, under varying regimes, that the desired image of the past is more important than the actual past. That the tourist picture is more important than the history of construction. That the state myth is more significant than the homes of the people who lived in them. Look at how it worked in real time. In the 1880s, several German architectural magazines published critical articles about Steinbrecht's methods in Malbork. The criticism was substantive and well-reasoned. The professional community understood what was happening. But the work continued, because it was funded by the state, and the state had other priorities. Similarly with Moker in Prague. The press criticized, professors wrote objections, yet the budgets were still approved. This is not a system that can be stopped by exposing a single conspiracy. It is a system that works precisely because all its participants act at their levels within their authority. The architect implements their theory. The official signs the budget. The minister gives a speech about historical heritage. The tourist comes and leaves satisfied. No one is lying on purpose. It's just that no one in this chain asks uncomfortable questions. Now pay attention to one thing that connects all these cases on an even deeper level. In each of them, the restorers chose a single point in time, the correct year or correct style, and declared it the only valid one. Everything that came before was prehistory. Everything that came after was deterioration or pollution. The castle must look as it did in the 12th century. It doesn't matter that it was rebuilt in the 13th, again in the 16th, and once more in the 18th. It doesn't matter that each of these changes was also part of history. Only one layer matters. The others are just trash. But who determines which layer is correct? Not historical science. It studies everything. Not logic. Logic knows no correct epochs. The correct layer is the one that serves the current political agenda. This is precisely why Steinbrecht chooses the Teutonic 15th century and dismisses the Polish 17th. This is why Mocher opts for the Gothic 14th and disregards the Renaissance 16th. This is why de Valle selects the Romanesque 12th and ignores everything that followed. The choice of the correct layer is always a political act, even if it is called scientific. A tourist walking today through the Gothic quarter of Barcelona sees the medieval Bisbe Bridge from 1928. A visitor to Carcassonne looks at roofs that have never existed at this latitude. A guest at the tower crosses a bridge that did not exist. They are all convinced they are witnessing history. They see an interpretation of history. An interpretation created for specific political, commercial, or ideological purposes. There is one counterintuitive point that should be mentioned directly. Most of the described sites became great tourist destinations precisely because of reassembly. Carcassonne, without Viollet-le-Duc's roofs, would likely not attract 3 million tourists a year. The Gothic quarter of Barcelona, without the Bisbe Bridge and the neo-Gothic facade of the cathedral, would not be what it is today. The tower, without the Victorian cleaning, would look like a neglected warehouse courtyard with a menagerie. This is not an excuse, but it is an honest observation. And this is what follows from this observation. What we call interest in history is, in most cases, an interest not in history itself, but in the image of history. People travel to Carcassonne not because they want to understand medieval fortification. They go there because they want to experience the medieval feeling. The pointed roofs, battlements, cobbled streets, all of this works like a machine for producing emotional experiences. And this machine operates all the more effectively the less genuine medievalness it contains, with its smells, crampedness, diseases, and boredom. 19th century restorers, unwittingly, did not create museums of the past. They created theme parks of the past. And that is why these places are so popular. They provide the desired experience without the inconveniences of real history. The image conquers history. Not because someone maliciously decided to deceive us, but because the image operates differently. The image is direct, pure, and clear. History is layered, contradictory, and uncomfortable. It contains a cotton factory in a medieval dungeon, Renaissance chambers in a Gothic castle, Baroque altars in a Romanesque cathedral, and Polish traces in a Teutonic fortress, as well as residential houses within the fortress walls. This is real history, multi-layered, mixed, never existing in the form of a single, pure style. And we want a picture, even teeth, sharp roofs, a unified style. Here it's worth pausing and honestly answering the question, what is being lost? If the image is convincing, if the tourists are happy, if the monuments stand, what's the problem? The problem is that this is a question about our attitude toward reality. When Polish layers in Malbork are referred to as pollution, it is not a neutral architectural judgment. It is a political statement suggesting that 300 years of Polish presence in this building do not count as the real history of the object. When the Renaissance chambers of Karlstein are demolished as distortions, it is a declaration that the 16th century for this building is considered the wrong century. When 52 houses are evicted in Carcassonne to avoid obstructing the view, it is a statement that the people living here in the present can be ignored for the sake of an image of the past. In all these cases, real people, the residents of homes, bearers of culture, inhabitants of buildings, are deemed a hindrance. Their experience, their history, their presence is seen as rubbish that must be cleared away for the image to work. And here's what's important. We look at these castles today and do not see that. We see beautiful towers. We see history. We do not see 52 homes. We do not see the steam engine in the dungeon. We do not see the palace of Henry III behind the White Tower, because all of this was removed before we were allowed to look. There is another aspect of this loss that is rarely discussed. When Moker was destroying the Renaissance chambers of Karlstein, he did so without any documentation. There were no blueprints before the demolition, no photographs, no measurements. Modern documentation technologies did not exist at that time, but there were draftsmen, there were artists, and none of them were given the task to record what would vanish, because it was not considered valuable. Similarly, in Lisbon, the archaeological layers from the 17th and 18th centuries were thrown away as garbage without any documentation. We do not know exactly what was found there because no one deemed it necessary to record it. An unnecessary layer means unnecessary information. It is irreversible. The Renaissance chambers of Karlstein cannot be restored. The palace of Henry III in the tower cannot be recreated. Even if someone wanted to, there is no data. 52 houses in Carcassonne cannot be reconstructed. No one photographed them, measured them, or described them. They disappeared because they interfered with the image, and were forgotten because they were not part of the necessary story. That is why this question is not just about architecture. It is a question of how the production of the past operates. Who decides what from the past is considered? Whose story makes it into the guidebook? And whose is discarded along with construction debris? There is a detail that speaks to this more accurately than any analysis. Viollet-le-Duc left behind a multi-volume dictionary, thousands of pages of drawings and descriptions. Steinbrecht published a monumental work on Malbork. De Waal prepared comprehensive restoration reports on Gravenstein. The documentation of what was built is extremely detailed. The documentation of what was demolished before the work began is almost non-existent. This asymmetry is not a coincidence. It reflects a hierarchy of values. The created image is worthy of memory. The destroyed history is not. Warsaw did the only honest thing in this entire story. It recreated the image and stated it aloud. The others created an image and called it history. Therefore, the map of European medieval monuments is not a map of the Middle Ages. It is a map of how different eras wanted to see the Middle Ages. A map of political ambitions, national myths, tourist brands, and architectural theories. A map of what was demolished to achieve the desired appearance. And if we look at it from this perspective, it becomes a much more interesting document. A document about ourselves, about how we construct the past for our own interests. Notice, this continues. Right now, as you watch this video, restoration work is taking place somewhere in Europe, where someone is making decisions about which historical layer is correct and which is excess. The tools have changed. There is now laser scanning, three-dimensional models, and historical documentation. The demands for transparency have become stricter, but decisions are still made by people with specific viewpoints, working within a particular political and financial context. The principles of the Venice Charter of 1964, an international document on restoration, explicitly prohibit the removal of historical layers and the addition of elements that were not originally present. On paper. In practice, this is regularly violated. In different countries to varying degrees, with different justifications. Historically accurate recreation. Return to the original appearance. The words are the same. The method is the same. But here's what's worth saying in the end, and this is not an attempt to undermine everything. The real Middle Ages are neither better nor worse than what we see in these castles. They are simply different. It was dirty, uncomfortable, multi-layered, politically manipulated by the same people with the same goals, just with different tools. Castles were not built for beauty, but for power. They were rebuilt, demolished, appropriated. People lived in them and died within their walls. None of them ever existed in a state of pure style, neither in the 12th century, nor in the 15th, nor in the 18th. What Viollet-le-Duc and his followers did to these buildings differs from what the medieval owners themselves did, not in essence, but in scale, and in the way they presented the result as authentic. Perhaps this is what you should carry with you when you find yourself in front of a medieval castle next time. Not disappointment, not a sense of deception, but another question, one that is more interesting than, is this authentic or not? The question is, what exactly did this lock mean? Who commissioned this message? To whom is it addressed? What had to be removed for this, and what was preserved? Carcassonne speaks of the French national greatness of the Second Empire era. Malbork spoke of the German right to the eastern lands. Lisbon's São Jorge spoke of the 800-year continuity of Portuguese statehood. Keusenstein speaks of a private longing for chivalric times, and at least is honest about it. And Warsaw speaks of a people who decided, if our city has been taken from us, we will reclaim it, and we will say so aloud. When you know exactly what the building is telling you, it doesn't become less interesting. It becomes more so. Authenticity does not exist in pure form. There is a degree of honesty in relation to what you have done. Warsaw is honest. Most of the others are not. And the next time you find yourself in front of a famous European castle, remember one simple question. If they preserved history, why did they have to demolish so much? Because the story they wanted to preserve never existed. It had to be created. This is exactly what was created.